right, hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in a series for the Western Governor's National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative. This webinar is titled The Future of Wild Horse and Burro Management, Challenges and Opportunities. It will last for the next 90 minutes. And I'm Bill Whitaker. I'm with WGA staff, and I'm here just to give a few technical details on the webinar. We're using WebEx software, and if you look on the right, you'll see that there's a chat box. Please, as attendees, use this chat box to submit any questions or comments you have to us about the webinar or wild horse and burro management, and we will write those down and use them, address them later in the webinar. The general format is we're going to start with a few minutes of introductions, first for myself and then for Troy Timmons, our lead, WGA's lead on this project, and then moving on to Congressman Chris Stewart is going to introduce the panelists and speak for a few minutes on the issues. After that, we'll move through each panelist. We'll give 5 to 10 minutes of introductory remarks on the issues, and then from there we'll move to approximately 20 minutes of moderated discussion of where the panelists will discuss questions related to the issue. After that, we're going to move on to a question and answer session where we will submit to the panelists questions that you send in throughout the webinar. So please let us know if you have any questions. And with that, I will hand it off to Troy Timmons, WGA's lead on the initiative.
Thanks, Bill. Just as a reminder, the National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative has 4 goals. The first is it's an opportunity for states to share their experiences with and ideas to improve land management activities on western forests and rangelands. The second goal is to examine collaboration and collaborative processes and how those are used to promote responsible management. The third is to evaluate the use of the current statutory authorities, things like stewardship contracting and good neighbor authority, that allow states and local communities to leverage their power to promote responsible management practices. The fourth is then to provide recommendation when we get to the end of this process, provide some recommendations for states, for federal agencies, and for Congress to further improve forest and range management activities. Today's topic is wild horses and burros. And Western governors have long been aware of the challenges posed by wild horse and burro populations. It's the subject of a WGA policy resolution. And while I think that all of us love the mental image of wild horses galloping across western rangelands, the physical reality facing wild horse and burros and western rangelands is often very different than that. Overpopulations can have a dramatic effect on rangeland, having a negative effect on riparian areas, on threatened and endangered species habitat, and decreasing the overall resilience of rangelands to factors like drought and invasive species and disease. At this point, I'll turn the mic over to Callie Stewart. Callie is the Director of Federal Affairs for Utah Governor Gary Herbert. Landscapes throughout the West are being affected by wild horse and burro populations, and Utah is one of the states that has spent a lot of time and effort grappling with the difficulties associated with responsible wild horse and burro management. So, Callie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Troy. I appreciate that introduction. You know, my job is pretty easy this morning. I was just asked to introduce our moderator, and I think we're very fortunate. Congressman Chris Stewart, he's the congressman from Utah's 2nd Congressional District. I'll be brief on his background. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's a world record-setting Air Force pilot and also a former business owner. He served a number of years in the Air Force and flew helicopters and B-1 bombers and has a very impressive track record. But I think the reason why we wanted him on this call and why we wanted him to lead this discussion is because Not only is he my uncle, but he's also happens to be a leading voice in Congress on the wild horse and burro issue. For the last 2 Congresses, he has introduced legislation that would give states a much greater say in how wild horse and burros are managed, and we thought that he'd be the ideal candidate to help lead this discussion, help moderate this discussion, and perhaps even more importantly, to in Congress and to let them know what those of us in the West, governors and county commissioners and others, think would be the appropriate path to move forward. So again, we feel very privileged to have Congressman Stewart join us and moderate the discussion, and with that, I will turn the time over to him.
For efforts, and it's an honor to be with you. I'll be brief in my remarks here. It's a beautiful day here in Utah. We've had a gorgeous fall out here in the West. I don't think there's anyone on this call who's not aware that we just recently had an election. Many of us are anxious to get back to Washington and to try to continue to work on these problems that are very difficult to solve. And the wild horse and burro management is a difficult problem, and it is a growing problem, as we're going to discuss here. And part of the reason it's such a problem is that the answers are very controversial. And they're so controversial that when you say, for example, one of the things that you're going to have to do, you can hardly describe it to people because, you know, heads explode all over Washington, D.C. if you talk about how you really might be necessary to manage some of these herds. And I think, Cody, you mentioned this, the legislation that we have keyed in on and the 2 pieces that we have really promoted is to give the states more say and more influence over how these herds are managed. It's an enormous problem in my district. Now, I'm not the only one who has that challenge. I recognize that some of you in Nevada, for example, is probably a bigger challenge for you than it is even here in Utah. But when you've got something like 67,000 wild horses and burros, and the number that we're supposed to manage is a little over 26,000, when you recognize that you've got another 40,000 in holding corrals, and that there's a 20% growth a year in these herds, you know, when we finally got BLM's attention is when they recognized that it was going to cost them $1 billion a year to manage it and to pay for these horses in the perhaps 5 years into the future. And that's devastating for any agency. I mean, it's a significant part of the entire BLM budget. So one personal experience, if you'll allow, I was down in the central part of my district, which is in southern Utah. And we went out with some ranchers just to look at what the impacts that these animals had on the range. And if you care about rangeland, if you care about, you know, not only endangered species, but endangered plants and other types of concerns that we may have, if you care about these horses, if you care about other wildlife and see the impact that this has on other game animals, it just takes a few minutes out on the range to see that what we are doing now is just completely unacceptable. And the slide that you see now was really one of the turning points in Congress, because in one of the hearings that we had on the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee where we were dealing with this, was when I held up this picture and I said, this is what we're left with. Look at this foal, look at this mother, and tell me that this is a good idea. Look at this and tell me that we can't do better than this. And once we had this visual illustration, and by the way, I got kind of spanked for doing that because in the meeting we're not supposed to bring visual aids. But, and I won't mention who, but a senior Democratic congressman came to me and he said, you know, we've got to find a way where we can work on this in a bipartisan manner. And so we were able to include some legislation that, again, was unanimously supported by Republicans and Democrats, because many of them recognize that we're destroying range, that we're making these animals suffer. If you care about wild horses, then you can't look at this and say, again, that this is acceptable. Well, last thing I'll say is that to illustrate the challenge we have, the DOI, Department of Interior Inspector General, just in the last few weeks, issued a report in which they recognized and stated that the BLM had no strategic plan to manage wild horses, none at all. And that was one of the challenges we had with the BLM director and others, was we asked them, don't come to Congress and talk about your new your new, drugs that you think are going to be contraceptive and some of your experimental studies on that, because it creates the impression that you're fixing the problem when the reality is that you're not. And when you come in and testify about these steps you're taking, for example, adoption, and you leave the impression that we're going to adopt out thousands of these wild horses and we're going to be able to mitigate the numbers when we know that that's not true. And it was a turning point when BLM was more, I think, open and honest in their testimony before Congress and saying we can't fix this problem without congressional help. The DOI report recommended that they develop a plan and put that in place. Well, that's stating the obvious. One of the things they recommended was they have to shift costs from long-term from short-term, which is going to save some money. But again, that doesn't fix the problem. That just is a funding issue. So we appreciate the Inspector General's, kind of backing us up on this, but we've still got a long way to go. So with that, I know that many of you will elaborate or probably mimic some of the things I've said because this problem isn't unique to the 2nd District in Utah. Let me thank our panelists for being with us, and I'm going to introduce them individually and just prior to giving them their 5 or 10 minutes. We're going to start with Dr. J.J. Goicoechea. And Doctor, if I messed up your name, please forgive me. And he has to actually leave shortly after this. So, Doctor, we're going to give you your time if you would, and then we'll probably open it up to questions before you have to take off. But just as a bit of an introduction, JJ is a 4th-generation rancher from Nevada. He was in private practice for 17 years before he recently accepted a job with the Nevada State Veterinarian. I believe that was just a little less than a year ago. He's the current vice chairman of the Federal Lands Commission and also serves as chairman of the Eureka County Board of County Commissioners and the Nevada Sagebrush Ecosystem Council. JJ, are you online with us? So, sir, we turn the time over to you now.
Okay. I hope everyone can see me okay. And, Bill, if you could put my my first slide up. Again, I'm J.J. Goicoechea. I'm a veterinarian out of East Central Nevada. I am on the Board of County Commissioners for Eureka County, Nevada, and I am currently serving in that chair. I guess the first thing I want to bring to everyone's attention is my title, the Wild Horse Emergency. First question everybody's going to ask is it truly an emergency? I'm going to tell you here today that in Nevada and across the West, it is no longer an emergency, it's a disaster, folks. The program is at a breaking point. As you just heard, that there was a recent report that talked about how much money off-range facilities are consuming. BLM has roughly an $80 million annual budget, and over 65% of that is being spent on off-range holding costs. Because of that, there are very limited gathers occurring. The BLM is saying we can't afford any more off-range holding, therefore we're not going to get more horses because we can't afford to put them anywhere. The state of Nevada alone has over 40,000 horses. Now, not all of those are what you would call wild and free roaming in that they're not all within herd management areas. Some of them are outside, but I'm going to be honest with you in that a lot of them are escaped horses from these herd management areas. They're kind of in areas where we manage them as feral and stray, but they were originally wild and free roaming horses in the sense of the 1971 Act. So what happens if we continue to ignore this? What can we expect? On the next slide, Bill, you'll see a picture of mares together late this summer. This is one of the lucky mares. Her body condition isn't nearly as severe as Congressman just showed. This was a dry mare, not have a foal on her side. She was not lactating. You can notice severe bite marks, scars, bruising. Mare watched her walk, but noticed that she had a difficult time walking because she was weak, had some serious injuries. Next slide. The area that she was gathered from, this is a spring in that area. There were over 200 horses in close proximity to this little seep in this spring. This was early on. You can see some damage that is being done to this riparian and this ecosystem. There's still a little bit of grass around there and some sagebrush, but if you go to the next slide, you'll see the progression and what does occur as late summer takes its effect on the driest state in the union here in Nevada. I don't think I need to tell anybody on this webinar that every rodent, every reptile, every large mammal that relied upon that riparian area and on this ecosystem has suffered greatly because of these impacts. It should also be noted that there has not been licensed domestic livestock grazing in this area for over a decade. What you see here today is exclusively wild horse use in this area, and I'll talk a little bit more about this exact area as we go ahead. So what is the BLM doing? If you go to the next slide, you'll see that they're kind of doing a Band-Aid approach. That picture that I just showed you, they did remove nearly 300 horses from that herd management area. Dozens of horses that we know of died there this year. At least 4 during those operations to try and help those horses. There were another 100 horses removed from another HMA, the Triple B. We know that in excess of 20 horses died at one location there just last year. These are small-scale bait and trap operations. They come in, they set up some panels, portable corrals around these waters, and they try to catch these horses as they're coming to this limited water. They shut the gate on them, and they take them to their locations where they provide care. Now, there's pros and cons to this, obviously. Some of the pros are it's less stressful on the animal than many would argue a helicopter gather. But if you go to the next slide, I'll show you one of the major cons to it. These are 2 stallions in that area. This photo was taken from a distance, so I had to enlarge it for you. But you'll notice that sorrel horse and his body condition. These horses were suffering from malnutrition because they would not leave the water source, because they waited there all day long for their chance to drink the very limited water, and sometimes they would go days without a drink. When you put a set of corrals and a water trap around these facilities, some of these horses stand on the outside. They will not come in there. They're animals, and they know something is going on. We have to know that some animals chose to stand outside, literally died for lack of water rather than coming into that water trap. So the BLM, if you go to the next slide, is now saying, well, we know we have a problem, so we're going to address it with fertility control instead of removal. We can't take any more horses off the range, so we're going to start doing more fertility control. Folks, if we have 40,000 horses in Nevada, just the idea that we are going to curb growth and wait through attrition in order for these horse numbers to limit themselves, it's absurd. We will see more horses dying. So there must be a multi-pronged approach. Gather these HMAs close to 100%, and then fertility control on those horses that we release. You go to the next slide. This is a Triple B HMA, and this is an example of why fertility control won't work. It's over 1.2 million acres in size. In 2016, it was estimated in the spring that there were 1,600 horses in that HMA. That's not counting the poles. So we've got 12,000-foot mountains. We've got pinyon juniper woodland. Like to go and hide when gather operations commence. There's just no possible way through passive fertility control that we are going to be able to effectively limit their growth. Go to the next slide. That's the map of the HMA. It's highlighted there. That entire area is this one HMA. Move ahead, you'll go to Pancake HMA. This is the one where the gather operation occurred late this summer. The AML for that is 293 horses. There's 1,800 horses there with current reproduction. We estimated 2,100 horses with this year's foal crop. This is where they took the 300 horses off. And if we go to the next slide, you can again see that on a map. The reason they decided to go in there and take those horses on the next slide. This is what was occurring in the Pancake HMA. That is one of the only water sources that was left available on the subject of that HMA. That area had actually been enclosed by the BLM in trying to save that riparian. Unfortunately, those horses were able to paw at that little bit of dirt and get inside there. And this is one of those that did not make it. There were dozens of horses just like this. So if you go to the next slide is another major thing in Nevada that we are concerned about, greater sage-grouse priority habitat. If you remember those last maps that go to, you can see those laid by over the top of this. Another area, if you go to the next slide, please, Bill, sagebrush focal area and the HMAs overlapping. Sagebrush focal areas are the best of the best sage-grouse habitat. You can see in that circle we have a large overlaying HMA over some of the best sage-grouse habitat we have in the state. Next slide discusses briefly the Hawaii that's currently going on. So if you go to that slide, the Owyhee gather, it's the Owyhee HMA. It's kind of a complex of the Little Owyhee, the Owyhee, and the Little Humboldt. They're scheduled a major roundup for this, 1,100 head. 1,100 head will almost get them to high AML. But the absurd thing that we're seeing here, they're going to take 1,100 head and they are not going to do any fertility control with those horses that they leave in that area, or very limited fertility control at best. In 4 years, we'll be right back here and having the same conversation and trying to get 1,000 to 1,100 horses do not mandatory fertility control, long permanent fertility control part of the solution. So on my final slide, what now? We need a third direction. Congressman Stewart, I believe, has spoke to that effect. We've got to switch grip. Congress needs BLM third direction. We need dedicated funds for on-range actions, and these solutions, we need some solutions for offsetting costs. We cannot continue to spend north of $40,000 for the life of these horses that we hold in off-range holding facilities. And I know that some of the other panelists will address those, so I'm not going to go into more details with that. So, time, Congress, any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, while we wait for the questions, this is Congressman Stewart again. JJ, thank you. That's a very, very effective presentation. Your visuals are just spot on, and that's the thing that changes people's minds is when they begin to see that. Again, if you care about these horses and other wildlife, you've got to recognize that we've got to fix this. I appreciate particularly your comments on fertility control and how that is not the answer, and many times BLM leaves the impression that it is, especially with congressional members, and we've just got to be more honest about that. So, Bill, do you have some of the attendees who have some questions?
We haven't received any yet from the attendees, so no, I suppose we can just go on with the next panelist.
Yeah, before we do, JJ, let me follow up with you on something, and that is, you know, I mentioned this in my opening comments about federal budgets, and many times the answer back in Washington is, well, we got to spend more money, and that's nuts. I mean, that's not the answer at all. Out of control wild horses and burro populations isn't controlled by the amount of money we spend there. And let me ask you, even if the budget were limitless, which it's not, but let's pretend that it was. Could the BLM properly manage these horse herds anyway under current authorities that they're given?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Under the Act, I believe they could, if they follow the Act, the way the Act was written, and that all options were on the table as far as what we did with the horses. And I know it is very unpopular to hear, and I know that the advisory committee did recommend this, but we need everything from wholesale sale of these horses, unconditional sale, and then you have euthanasia of these horses that are unadoptable. We have to do something with them. So is it manageable? Yes. Is it manageable the way they're going now? No. We could triple their budget, and if we continue to go down this path, we'll see triple the horses and triple.
Well, and that's why this legislation that we've included in the appropriations bill this year opens up doors that just haven't been opened before by allowing for, the states to have control over these wild horse populations, and we're a little ways away from getting that legislation passed. But the one that's more immediate and that we are going to, I think, be successful in, and that's allowing for euthanasia if that is necessary to control these populations. And if you've got a choice between a merciful euthanasia program versus a starvation program, it seems to me obvious which one is a better answer. But Doctor, appreciate your time with us. Stay as long as you can. There may be other questions directed towards you, but I know that you have to leave shortly. So again, thank you. Very effective. Our next panelist is a good friend of mine, Tammy Pearson. You see her slide up on your computers now. The most important thing I can say about Tammy is that the education and the background that she brings to this isn't the kind you buy from a school. It's kind of the school of real life and the school of hard knocks. She grew up on a family-run farm and ranch operation, and she and her family are still ranching today. She attended Utah State in ag science and worked for 6 years as an extension agent. The Pearsons own and operate 600 acres of irrigated farm, and they have more than 600 head of Hereford and Angus. More than 10,000 acres of private and BLM and state trust land permits. She served as the Twin M Conservation Clerk for 30 years, served in the Rocky Ford Irrigation Board, and is a member of the Beaver County Cattlemen and Farm Bureau. And again, one of the commissioners in my district, one of the leaders, one of those commissioners that just has a natural ability to influence and to lead. So, Commissioner Pearson, so glad to have you with us, and we turn the time to you now.
Good morning, Chris. Appreciate you moderating for us. I think this is an important topic, and if we can get our slideshow going again, at least on my end, we're messed up.
Looks like we're coming back at you now. There you go. Okay,
there we go. Okay, this picture itself is a Beaver County range tour that we held in August. We had the governor and our BLM. We had a lot of people there, cattlemen's, SFW. This is actually a reseed that is damaged by wild horses. So on the next slide, we'll go right into the meat and potatoes of things. Our Southwest Desert on the HMAs were actually at 409% above AML. We're in different areas are doing the exact same thing Nevada is. We have a lot of damaged ground. We'll provide that on the next slides. So go ahead and advance that. This is the HMAs in our area. So the red outlines are the different HMAs. The green dots are GPS coordinates on some of the horse sightings. This was done by a flyover with the Division of Wildlife in February. And so what we're seeing is within the HMAs that were established in 1971 with the Wild Horse and Burro Act, the overpopulation, they're coming outside of those, and so they're grazing on private property, they're grazing on state trust lands, and they're doing a lot of damage. Next slide. This shows our the different populations in each one of the HMAs. So the numbers speak for themselves. So on the next slide, we've got, this is part of our tour. This is an exclosure fence, and it's kind of hard to tell, but within the fence, the grass is actually knee-high. This is something that the horses can't get to, so that's what the whole range, the whole reseed should look at. Now, on the information underneath, this particular, family-run operation, the damage that the horses have done to them in the last 3 years is almost $500,000. And in our little community or our county, we're 77% BLM, and our whole county economy depends on the revenue that comes through grazing and agriculture. So on the next few slides, we'll try and run through these pretty fast. These are all of the same areas. They're historic data keeping slides that we've done. On the left is a reseed that was established in 1990, and this is the exact same view, exact same area 13 years later, and the grass is gone. And it is all because of wild horses. On the next slide, this gives you a different view of a similar reseed. You can see the progression of damage that's happened over the 25 years. Next slide. There's your close-up. So you can just see the degradation, what happens with overgrazing and overpopulation. Next slide. This gives you an example in our county what the areas should look like if they're properly managed. Now, with strictly livestock and not no horse or whatever, and on a strict rotation, the top picture will show you a 2-month rotation. The livestock are in each individual pasture for 2 months out of the year. The other 10 months of the year, the pasture is rested, can regrow, heal, whatever. The only thing that's going to bother it now is the wildlife. On the second pasture is a fall, or the second picture is a fall picture, and you can see these guys are moving cows from one pasture that's been used into one that's not been used. So you can see there's a lot of use on the left side, but even at that, where they trail along the fence, you can still see there's a lot of grass and growth on that left side, and common practice is to leave half, eat half and leave half. On our next slide, this shows damage on riparian areas on springs and that. This is where the horses, it's outside of an HMA, but this is one of the producers' winter range, and they have not had cows in here for over 4 years because there's no grass. Cows eat grass, they need grass, so does wildlife, and the horses, between the the traffic and that and the overpopulation, there's no grass left anywhere. It's just gone. Next slide. So rangeland damage by overgrazing has a negative effect on wildlife, on livestock, and in our county, especially these rural counties, depend on the permittee's revenue. It affects the agricultural families' revenue, the rural communities' economy, and rural counties' economy. Next slide. So the permittees, they're the ones that are managing. They're responsible, and they take care of the maintenance and that on all the springs, the water sources and that. And the only way to take care of it, because nobody else is doing that, putting up panels, trying to protect those water sources, putting in new ring tanks and that. So these springs will be piped down into these water troughs and hopefully try and save those springs. On our next slide, that's the same sort of thing. This is a big traffic area, and you can see it's nothing but horses. There's not been any cows there for over 4 years. There's a handful of wildlife, and that's the damage that you see from the horses. Next slide. This is a riparian area outside of the HMA on private property. It's one of the few spring sources there, and they have just tromped it and tromped it, tromped it. They've jumped the fences, they've tore the fences down, so it's just more riparian area damage. Next slide. Okay, so this is, one of the horses. This is what happens. Next slide. Overpopulation results. In the winter, we've got horses on protein tubs. If it wasn't for the rancher, those horses, they'd be dead already because we're supplementing everything. Next slide. We can just keep going. Next slide. So these winter ranges, some of these guys have kept their cattle home for the whole entire winter because there's no grass to take them on. So that's an additional cost. It's a hit to the economy for the county and the family operations. On our next slide. Okay, our expected growth on a 20% is going to be, in 4 years, is going to be 980% of AML. We're at 408 right now. We had 438 new foals if you count the 20% crop for this year. Next slide. If we had proper management, like how the livestock and that do theirs, and the horse numbers were at proper AMLs, you'd have good range. You'd have healthy horses, healthy wildlife, healthy livestock, and a healthy local economy for these rural counties, and it's critical. Next slide. So as a county commissioner, I'm sworn to protect the health, safety, welfare, and culture of the people in my community. I also, as an elected official, try to represent the best interests of my people, the community, and the county, and the natural resources within the boundaries of our county. This is, and will be, just like JJ said, it's the worst case of inhumane treatment of animals and man-made ecological disasters in the history of the West. Next slide. So I'm asking, I mean, this is a plea from a rural commissioner, from however you want to call it. We've got to have our elected officials, the Western Governors Association, their staff, to be involved in finding the ultimate solutions and ending this impending disaster. Please consider and act on immediate common sense solutions. It's got to be common sense and practical solutions. And to quote Mitt Romney, able leaders anticipate events, prepare for them, and act in time to shape them, and I'm asking for your help. Thank you.
Tammy, very nicely done. Thank you. And, you know, you say once again, we're looking for leaders to lead on this, and we've just got to be able to convince more people in Washington, D.C. that we've got to release our responsibility for this to those who understand the problem and know how to fix it. Because, frankly, members of Congress don't understand this problem. They just really don't. And they have so much on their plate, so many things that they have to deal with, and it's hard to get this up on their radar, frankly, that it helped them understand what an enormous problem this is out in western states. And we'll keep banging on that, I promise you, and we'll keep trying to educate and to help them understand. So thank you, Tammy. Nicely done. And by the way, you clocked in at 9 minutes, 27 seconds, under your 10-minute time limit. Way to go.
Oh, well, thank you. I was shooting for 7.
Well, and we'll come back to you, Tammy, with some questions and some other comments, I'm sure. So our next panelist is Dr. Eureka Thacker. And Doctor, I'm sorry, I did not receive bio information on you, and I'd be happy to say, you know, how qualified and what an expert you are, but we're going to have to leave it up to you to toot your own horn. So please do, though. Let us know your background, and then you know, share with us your comments and whatever you want us to know.
Thank you, Representative Stewart. Next slide, please. So I am a native of Utah. I've been a professor at Utah State for about three and a half years. I grew up in Duchesne County, attended Utah State, spent some time working for the Agricultural Research Service, 3.5-year stint in Oklahoma, and I was glad to come back to Utah. At Utah State, my main function is I function as a range extension specialist for the state of Utah. So these wild horse issues have surfaced, and due to concern from producers and even from the agencies, it's caused quite a bit of problems. Next slide, please. So as I started looking at this problem a couple of years ago, the one thing that stood out to me as I started looking at numbers is I wanted to know if we had ever been at AML in the state of Utah. And so the numbers that I was able to find off from the BLM website, since 1995, we've not been close to within the high AML, or the appropriate management level for the wild horses. So this isn't a new problem. It's been building and coming for some time. I agree with JJ that we've reached a point where something has to be done. Our rangelands, in many cases, which were clearly illustrated from Tammy's photos and JJ's photos, that we have some situations where rangelands are in desperate condition. Next slide. So there's a great paper in the journal Science that was published back in 2013, and Garrett and Oley predicted the cost of these horses over time. And what they found is that costs were increasing exponentially, and that by 2030 we will have spent over $1 billion on the wild horse problem, and most of that money is being spent on captive horses. And I think this is the piece of the puzzle that's often forgotten about by the average citizen and the average taxpayer, that the great burden and the great cost that comes to the citizens based upon maintaining these horses in pen facilities. Additionally, the wild horse program is continuing to increase the cost of what it's costing to run that program on an annual basis, to where, you know, predictions are that it's going to be up over close to $100 million annually to run the wild horse and burro program. So we're reaching a point where something has to give. It's becoming more cost prohibitive. Next slide, please. So on top of that, I think one of the problems is the economic impact from wild horses is not felt evenly across the country. Your average citizen in an urban setting and even some other rural counties don't feel the impact of those wild horses. There was a study done in the late 90s in Wyoming where they estimated that the lost opportunity cost, this is due to livestock forage, and even revenue lost from wildlife hunting opportunities, was costing a rural county about $1,900 per head per year for each of those wild horses over the AML amount. So I think when I started looking at this, I think it's important to point out that we're not asking for the wild horses necessarily to be completely removed from the rangelands, but we need to be able to manage them. And an important part of grazing management is being able to manage the numbers. So in the next slide, these are the 4 principles of grazing management that I teach every semester to students coming through class. And I think it's important to point out that this is where we're having problems, and this is why we end up with rangelands that look like the pictures that Tammy showed. So when we talk about grazing management, we talk about what type of animal is going to be on the rangeland, matching animals to the range conditions. We talk about how many animals are on the rangeland, when they graze, when they don't graze, how long will they rest. Tammy alluded to the fact that they rest a lot of their pastures, which is good grazing management. And then where the animals graze, the grazing distribution. Next slide, please. But when we start looking at wild horses, we don't get to choose which animal and where. Next slide. We are having a difficult time at this point, and we're not controlling how many animals are on the rangelands. Next slide, please. We have little or no control of when they graze or when they don't graze. We're not allowing any of these rangelands where these wild horses are exceeding numbers to be rested. Next. And then where the animals graze, and this becomes really important. As you saw those riparian areas, the problem with riparian areas is in a very arid system, you have limited water, and that means that the use around those watering points, which are literally an oasis in the desert for livestock, for other wildlife species, get heavily overused. The one thing that's becoming more and more clear over the years as we conduct more grazing research is that rest is imperative, especially along these riparian areas. We have to allow some portion of the growing season where we're not grazing those riparian areas to allow those plants to recover. You have to allow a plant to be able to grow some leaf material in order to maintain its roots. If you can't maintain roots, then drought becomes a major limiting factor in grass plants being able to persist through droughts and different disturbances that may impact them negatively. Next slide, please. Next slide. So recently, one of the solutions that was proposed, so there's a Wild Horse and Burro board. This is a collection of scientists, interested public, landowners, agency personnel, and this board advises the BLM on management of the wild horse and burro situation and some of their management objectives. So it's interesting to point out that this is the first time that I think the board has agreed with JJ that we're at a crisis level. And one of the things that they recommended at this point is that they're just going to have to flat get rid of animals. So if you think back to that graph and from the Garrett paper, one of the other things that he pointed out in that research is that while we can use contraceptives for wild horses, they really don't address the problem. The problem is too many animals on the range, and too many animals leads to rangeland degradation. So with the contraceptives, all we do is we slow the growth rate of the population. That's not accounting for all of those other animals that are in excess that live on the range. Wild horses can live up to about 15 plus years. That's a long time to wait for the attrition to catch up. So even if contraceptives were a very feasible option, it still doesn't deal with the problem of too many horses in captivity and too many horses on the rangelands. So the Wild Horse and Burro Board actually proposed selling those horses without limits, or even euthanasia for those that they were not able to get rid of or adopt. Obviously, this has been met with a great deal of resistance. There was a pretty good splash in the media recently. You know it's a big deal when even Snoops picks it up in terms of fact-checking. Next slide, please. So conclusions, really fast, wrapping up. Current policy does not address the excessive numbers. And again, repeating, even with the contraception and use of contraceptives, they're still limited in their ability to control the excess numbers that we're currently trying to manage. Next. These impacts are most severe at the county level. The counties like Beaver County are bearing the cost of these horses being on the rangelands. And I think that needs to be addressed. Next. Monitoring data. I think monitoring data is needed to help make sure that we're making the right decisions. Although we don't really need much monitoring data when you look at a lot of the pictures we've looked at today, across the broad swath of the West, we need to have a better understanding of what level of impact these horse numbers are having. We really don't even know if the high AML numbers are sustainable in terms of range condition. Next slide, please. So there's a few data gaps that I think people should consider as we look at this wild horse issue. Next. So landscape impacts, we're looking a lot at these localized impacts and the impacts they're having around water. That's most often where they concentrate. But across, you know, thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres of the West, what impact have they had at a much broader scale? What kind of productivity have we potentially lost as they've degraded those landscapes? And what is the long-term ramifications of those meetings? Next. And then local level economic impact. As I've already mentioned, these impacts are felt most often at the local level. Next. So, reiterating what the previous speakers have already talked about, this is going to require a paradigm shift and a policy shift. The current paradigm for wild horse management is not addressing these problems. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Dr. Thacker. It's again very effective. Hey, and I want to ask a question here, and I know we want to reserve the time at the end of our presentations for questions, but it's one that a number of people have asked of our attendees. It's the question that I get asked, or at least it's suggested most frequently with my colleagues and other people that I meet both back in Washington, D.C. and frankly just around the country. And that is when people see the impacts that we have on the range and the impacts we're having on these horse populations, most of them say, well, you know, we need to just withdraw the grazing permits. If we took the cattle off of these ranges and left it for the horses, that they would be, you know, wouldn't be competing with the livestock and they'd be able to have healthy herds. Do any of the panel members want to address that?
Well, Representative Stewart, I think one of the first things to recognize is that when you have an animal species that it's reproducing at 20% annually, I think they would fill up available space much faster than people recognize. And I think you would make the problems worse and across a greater swath pretty quickly. Plus, you've got competing legislation. The Taylor Grazing Act, which was passed in the 1930s, there's some strong legal guarantees for grazing to occur on those public lands. So it's really, I think this problem could be resolved if the wild horses just were managed within the legislation that outlined their initial protection.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to voice a thought on that?
This is Callie Hendrickson.
Yeah, Callie, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, and I get asked that question a lot, and I think it's worth really evaluating. But a straightforward, and I know it's much more complicated than this, but the bottom line is you take an HMA that's got horses and livestock on it. We pull all the livestock off of it, and what does that do for us once those livestock are pulled off? 4 years from now, we have double the number of horses. And 4 years from then, we have double the number of horses. So removing the livestock sounds simple, and as Dr. Thacker said, you know, it's not that simple, but it's not a reality to address the real problem of too many animals and in a situation that they cannot be managed and rotated around through grazing practices like they do the livestock.
Yeah. Thank you, Callie, and I'm going to introduce you now. Again, Dr. Thacker, thank you. That was an informative presentation that you packed into 9 minutes, 9 seconds. Well done, sir. Callie Hendrickson, we're pleased and honored to have you with us today. A little bit of your background before we turn the time over to you. Callie's a native of Western Colorado, which I think is indicative of the importance of this. Isn't a Nevada problem. It's not a Utah problem. It's a Western problem, and it impacts many of the Western states. She received horse training and management degree from Lamar Community College, and she was a professional cutting and reining horse trainer and breeder during the 80s and 90s. She currently serves as a working group member of the National Horse and Burro Rangeland Management Coalition. She served for a 3-year term in the public at large position on the BLM Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board from 2012 to 2014, which of course brings an enormous breadth of background and expertise because of serving on that position. And although I could say more, the last thing I'll say about Callie is she's also serving as the American Farm Bureau Federation's Public Lands Advisory Committee Chair, which of course is focused on a multitude of federal land management issues. So Callie, great to have you with us. The time is yours.
Thank you, Representative Stewart. I greatly appreciate that. And I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. If we could go ahead and move to the next slide. So I think this is what we all want to see, is healthy horses on healthy rangelands. And this is a picture that I took in Wyoming when sitting on the advisory board. We did a tour, and we can have healthy horses on healthy rangelands. Next. And as all the other speakers have presented, the need for healthy rangelands, not only does it provide us healthy wildlife, but simply healthy watersheds that all of the species out there depend on, but so do the people who live in the western communities, and the rural communities truly depend on that watershed health. Next. This is a series of photos that were taken through a trail camera in southwest Colorado at the Mesa Verde National Park. And I know these horses weren't protected by the Wild Horse and Burro Act, but that doesn't mean they're not the same. They don't have the same habits of all horses. This is a foal chasing a cow elk from the last drink of water that was in the Mesa Verde National Park a couple of years ago during the drought. This really became a high-profile case in that area because there were a couple horses that were found dead because they were not able to drink, or they ran out of water. But no one discussed what had happened to the elk that obviously had been run off from the water, because the horses are the more dominant species. So they're going to be what I refer to as the last man standing. Next slide. Again, some more pictures that we saw that, you know, just reiterates the challenges that we're seeing out on the range. These both happen to be in Nevada still, and sad but true, Nevada is ground zero, as Tammy calls it, and I can't agree more. The mare on the left is a Cold Creek area where they removed the horses in 15. Of the 200 that they gathered and removed, they had to put 30 of them down because they were in such bad shape. The horse on the right, obviously the emergency gather was too late for him and several others. Next slide. The need for proactive management on these western rangelands cannot be stated strongly enough. The fact that we typically have anywhere from 5 and at best 15 inches of annual precipitation is just critical that we do proactive management and not let them get degraded, because once they pass a threshold, they cannot be reclaimed. And I just want to point out, 3 of these pictures are in Nevada, and 3 of them are in northwestern Colorado. I took 5 of them. The upper left-hand corner is one that the advisory board, one of the advisory board members took out in Nevada, which helped them to make that decision and recommendation that they did propose to the BLM. Next slide. BLM's mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. Next slide. BLM is a multiple use management agency. They manage everything out there. Wildlife is managed through harvesting by offering hunting licenses. Oil and gas is managed through permitting and regulation. Forest health is managed through timber harvesting and burning. Recreation is managed through permits and regulation. Today, you can't even go out on a four-wheeler and go just wherever you want to. There are regulations as to what and where you should be going. Livestock grazing is managed through permits with timing, rotation, and number restrictions, has already been stated. Wild horses, unfortunately, the law is being disregarded and with very limited management implemented. Next. So let's talk about some options that are out there, or some things that we can do within to improve, I shouldn't say to improve, options that are out there for the management of horses. We can leave them on the range, and this is what we're going to see. We're going to see more and more horses looking like this until they die. We're going to see more and more land looking like those two bottom pictures. Unfortunately, if we continue to leave horse numbers to grow, our herd management areas, in my opinion, are going to be sacrificed areas. Next. A second option is to gather and place horses in holding facilities. If money is no object, this is certainly an option, and at least the horses will not succumb to starvation or dehydration. But the question is there a limited pot of money for this part of the program? Right now it is roughly $50 million a year that it's costing taxpayers to feed the 46,000 horses that are currently in holding facilities. Next. Fertility control, we've talked about that a bit, and as many have stated, you know, fertility control is something that it's a feel-good conversation, but it only slows the population growth. It doesn't reduce the population. So therefore, if we are over AML, it's not going to really solve the problem. Some of the but really the only fertility control mechanism we're using right now is PVP. It is successful on very small herd management areas where they are near AML, and as others have stated, the possibility of implementing it on large HMAs is basically impossible. Due to lawsuits, BLM can't even do the research to see what sterilization could do to help in this management of this situation. So that has been one tool that has been pulled away from BLM. Again, I should say another tool that's been pulled away from BLM. And I just want to reiterate, I don't see how we can fertility control our way out of this. So next slide, please. I've heard a number of people say, well, let's just increase adoptions. That'll fix it. We're spending $5 to $7 million a year to adopt about 2,500 head of horses. And that doesn't go very far when we have almost 100,000 excess horses that need to be adopted. And we have about 14,000 being born every year. Again, I don't think we can adopt our way out of this. Next slide, please. As was mentioned earlier, the idea of transferring ownership, I think that this is another tool that would be nice to be added to BLM toolbox. It would allow for like the Border Patrol to be able to use the horses and so forth that way. Again, it's pretty limited demand, but it may offer a home to a number of horses. Next slide, please. So humane euthanization and the sale without restrictions are an option in the Wild Horse and Burro Act, but they're not being considered today by BLM because the appropriations language prohibits the BLM to use funding for the destruction of healthy, unadopted wild horses and burros in the care of the Bureau or its contractors, or for the sale of wild horses and burros that results in their destruction for processing into commercial products. Next slide. In September, the Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board made the recommendation for BLM to follow the law and work with Congress to be able to actually utilize the euthanization and sale without restriction. So this is language that's lifted directly out of the Act itself, and so it does say that BLM shall destroy horses in the most humane and cost-effective manner, and that they shall be made available for sale without restriction. And it even goes on to say, including through auction to the highest bidder at local sale yards or other convenient livestock selling facilities. Next slide. So what's coming next? Double the number of horses in 4 years, and double that number if we continue the status quo. And I just want to do a real quick summary of what I see the status quo is, and that is continuing to tell ourselves that fertility control will solve the problem, continue to tell ourselves that adoptions will solve the problem, leave the excess horses on the range except for emergency gathers, allow them to continue to increase their numbers by 15 to 20% a year, and the BLM leadership asking for additional resources, but when real resources are offered, then they dismiss them. So that's where we're at. We're going to find more horses on the range, and BLM continuing to do research, but right now they can't implement anything that they've actually found, and I don't think we can wait for research. Next slide, please. So my point of view is all of those tools that I mentioned are important and are going to be critical in order for BLM to be able to manage these. We need all of those tools in the toolbox. We need them, and we need them now to protect the rangelands and the horses so that we don't see this kind of damage and death and destruction. So with that, the next slide has some websites for more information. Thank you.
All right, Callie, thank you again. I'm going to ask a question here, and then before I introduce my good friend and our last panelist, Ms. Kathleen Clarke, but I don't know if JJ is on the call still, but if not, I think others of you could address this, and that is, you know, when you have it described to you, the inoculation process and how difficult that is, and how unlikely it is to be effective, do any of the panelists want to describe for those who may be, you know, on with us today, you know, exactly what BLM has to do in order to inoculate these stallions with these contraceptives?
Do you want to take that, Callie, or would you like me to?
Sure. I can. I was hoping JJ was on the call, but it doesn't sound like he is. So, okay. You know, in my understanding, I have not been deeply involved in it, but my understanding is, and so the darting and so forth that we're talking about are for the mares. They need to have the first injection followed by a booster within a month to 6 weeks. So in order for it to be truly effective. So when they gather the horses, if they were to actually inject the mares before when they release horses out on the range, which is, I mean, it's frustrating to release any back when they're still over AML, but release the horses out on the range, inoculated. But the problem is, in 6 weeks, you need to have them another shot. So either you need to keep them in holding or be able to dart the mares. Then it only lasts for 1 year. And so the same mare needs a shot next year as well. If she does not receive a shot the next year, the fact that she has been not had a foal, and so she's probably in much better flesh condition than others would be, chances of her being bred and certainly having a foal the following year is almost a guarantee. So if they don't follow up on those annual boosters, if you want to call it that, then you actually end up with chances of increasing the population or the foaling rate than decreasing it.
Yeah, and in fact, I've been told that two darts probably aren't enough. You may have to hit them 3 times. You got to do it 30, as you said, 30 days to 6 weeks apart, and you got to do it year after year after year. And if we think this is going to work, then what evidence is there that it has worked up to this point? I mean, it just isn't. And I know there are some there are some experimental drugs that they think may be more effective, but this is where we needed to convince BLM when they came and talked to us in Congress is don't indicate what isn't true or what we don't know yet, and that is this new experimental inoculation is going to take care of the problem because we're far, far away from having one shot that you hit these guys with and then it takes care of the problem forever after that because it's just not the case. Well, finally, we come to Ms. Clarke, who is, again, a good friend of mine and my family's. She's been a leader out here in Utah and a leader on the national level as well for many years. She's currently director of Utah's Public Land Policy Office. She served for five years as the national director of the BLM, where she was responsible for the wild horse and burro program, so she brings a very strategic view to this. She's intimately familiar with many of the conflicts and the challenges that the herds generate, and as we've described here today, I think, pretty effectively with our panelists so far. She's also served as the director of the Utah Department of Natural Resources and deputy director of the Utah Department of Agriculture, and she has been an integral part of working with members of Congress in both the House and the Senate for many years, and I don't think there's anyone that, as a member of the delegation, I think I can speak for all of us, saying there's no one that we trust nor respect more than Ms. Clarke. So, Kathleen, so good to have you with us.
Representative, thank you. I feel very honored to have been asked to serve on this panel, and I think the presentations before mine have been excellent. And I think they have really defined the problem, and hopefully folks recognize that we are in a crisis, an emergency that needs attention now. I'm going to speak to this from the position of why should the states get involved? Isn't this just a federal problem and a problem with local communities? And I would say absolutely not. The states, the Western governors, I think should have compelling interests that would move them to act. First of all, let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about what the state's responsible for. In each case in the Western states, we're responsible for wildlife management for every species out there except for T&E species, threatened and endangered species. One thing that is happening is, as was demonstrated and shown in photos, we are harming the habitat of the wildlife populations that we're responsible for. And, you know, that is just unacceptable. We're allowing that to happen. It's got to change. And I think it is most unusual that you look at there are two major categories of wildlife management. One of them is the T&E species that feds manage, and the other one is everything else except wild horses. They are the only other species of wildlife that is treated by a special agency who is to manage them, and yet it isn't a biological agency. That's not where the specialists and the folks that know how to do this are located. So it's just an anomaly. Next, we have great responsibility for the impacts to the water in the West. Let's move the slide. You know, we are all facing great population increases in our states and a growing, expanding demand for water. And one of the challenges created for every state who manages the water in their state, and in the West we all do, but we are seeing a very sharp decrease in water yield. We are losing the aquifer, we're losing the access to these waters, and you've seen that over and over again in slides. Water quality is down, water quantity is down, and it's simply a state has a compelling interest to get involved. Go to the next slide, and I'll just speak very briefly to the impacts to state and private land. And the state land that we're talking about is primarily land that benefits the school children and is held in trust for them. the more money that trust makes, the less money that has to come out of the state's limited budget. And so we rely on the school trust lands to be productive and to be able to contribute funds for the education programs in the state. What we're seeing is that as the lands, the sitla lands are destroyed, obviously the grazing permits are canceled and funding to those agencies is gone. There's no way you can isolate, or excuse me, no way you can manage horses so they stay within jurisdictional boundaries. They see, a sitla parcel to them is just like every other piece of land out there, and they run wildly from the federal domain lands to the school lands, and then they run on private lands and are destroying private lands. You know, I find it really interesting that our ranchers will get a trespass notice that goes in their file and that might cause them to lose their permit if they have 2 or 3 horses left on the range for several days after their permit dictates that they pull them off, and they get a trespass notice. Well, we ought to be able to trespass these federal horses when they are on state and private lands and abusing them. The next slide I have just shows land ownership. About 66% of the state of Utah is owned, managed by the federal government. But I always like to say that we own that land. We are the people, and we all own it. And we all ought to be able to demand that the government, if they're going to get in charge of this, that they be called to task and be accountable. We also are highly dependent on these federal lands for the economic stability within the state. And I think it behooves the states to understand and act based on those needs. Let's go to the next slide. And just for a minute, how on earth did we end up in this place? Where did this act come from? And, you know, it really came from a group of junior high kids and a woman who was a real zealot, and they all lobbied Congress, and they had this wonderful icon out west that they wanted protected. And the name of the woman was Wild Horse Annie, and they started up a storm and were successful in convincing the federal legislature that the animals were actually in decline and threatened. I have lost the picture on my screen, so I would like to see, Bill, if you can get me to my slide that says, what is in the wild horse and burro legislation? Are you there?
That slide's up, yes, Kathleen, that slide's up.
Okay. And then let's go to the next one. The Wild Horse and Burro Act demands that BLM protect, manage, and control wild horse and burro populations. Pretty simple, but that is the law. If you look at the next slide, it talks about the mandate for BLM to maintain a natural ecological balance of all the species out there. And I think it is fair to assert that they need to balance as well for the uses like grazing. This is a multiple use agency that has a mandate to provide grazing opportunities, and in my mind they simply cannot sit back and allow this to happen at the expense of the ranchers and to conveniently or inconveniently have to cancel those permits. If you go to the next slide, BLM also has a legal mandate to inventory those animals, and they do have to inventory annually. But then, if they determine there is an excess population, they're to remove them. They are to remove those animals, and they are to consult with the state wildlife agencies. The next slide, you get into a little more detail about that removal. When there is an overpopulation, the mandate is that the Secretary shall immediately remove the wild horse and burros. And then it lays out a priority for how to deal with the animals and which ones to be removed first and what their options are. It clearly says that euthanasia is an option, and that for excess wild horses and burros that cannot be adopted, then they should be privately captured and humanely destroyed. On the next section, it talks about the conditions under which wild horse and burros can be sold, and that they ought to be able to be sold without limitation if the situation dictates. On the next slide, and I'm not picking just on the Humane Society and the Association, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but those are two very highly visible activist groups. And I can tell you that there are many more groups that have as a singular focus the wild horse and burros. These folks have a lot of political influence in Washington, D.C. They are connected with the media, and as we watched kind of the circus of media through this political season, you start to understand how dramatically politics affects all kinds of things. And when you start talking about wild horses and burros, it very quickly turns into a them and us discussion about, you know, we got to save these wonderful animals or you folks want to kill them. And in the harshest of terms, they demonize the agencies if they want to do that. When I was at the BLM, we actually had legally sold some animals. They ended up, and they were to be sold without a threat of euthanasia, but they ended up at a processing slaughter plant, and the secretary found out that they were there, and she did not want to deal with the negative feedback, the press, that you're killing the animals kind of rhetoric. So she called me and said, you've got to stop this. So I called the plant owner and I said, do you have indeed some wild horses? And he says, I do, and they're already in the chute. And I had to ask him to stop all operations and get those that had not yet been slaughtered to get them out of the ring. You know, a bit absurd, but it was not because the law required that. It was because the politics were so rancid that it would have been, the secretary found it totally unpalatable to allow that situation to persist. We've got to have some action, and there's been a lot of talk about what the BLM can or can't do, should or shouldn't be doing, and we've all harped lots at the BLM. Excuse me, I need a drink of water. But I have to tell you, this problem is a lot bigger than the BLM. We have come to the WGA with this problem because we need the clout of the Western governors to help raise the awareness in the Congress of the United States as to the imperative that they start to do something to deal with this crisis. Options were laid out by Callie, some of those possibilities. Whatever it is, it needs to be done very, very quickly. One option that I've heard is transfer the animals to the states, and I've cautioned the state only sign on to that deal if you are relieved of the federal mandate and that you can start fresh. If that happened, they would be managed like all of the other wildlife in the state by the Fish and Game. And, you know, BLM actually had Fish and Wildlife in Washington do a study to see if these could be classified as threatened and endangered. Well, any species that is doubling their population every 4 years cannot be classified as threatened or endangered, but they are threatening and endangering everything that they are close to. This is a call to action, and I think all of us on the panel, and we hope all of you who have learned through this webinar will join us in a call to action. Let's get the Congress educated, and let's overcome our fear of the politics of this and have a clear mandate to the BLM to follow the law. They've got the tools they need right now to do what needs to be done, but they're intimidated by the politics of the national activists. So let's get together. The last slide is that Congress must be part of the solution. And I've got an Einstein quote there. We cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. We've got to be smarter. We've got to be rational about this. We can't be emotional. And we've got to look to the future and what we're allowing to happen to the lands within our states and within our boundaries. Thanks for this opportunity.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. And we're a little short on time now. We want to allow just the last few minutes for some questions. I would like to just reemphasize some things that you said, Kathleen, and that is that the Congress has got to be part of the solution, and we need your help. We need everyone who's on this call to help us with this. We need the Western governors. We need activists. We need those who work in policy, those who work within the agencies. And there is a very humane argument that is on our side, and that is, as you've seen again and again in these pictures, if you care about these animals, if you care about other wildlife, if you care about the rangeland, then you've got to help us. What we are doing now is completely unacceptable. The second thing I would just like to add, and that is that the legislation that I sponsored that would release and transfer responsibility of these animals to the states would preclude the prohibitions that are in federal law now. It would allow the states to deal with this in a different way. And as you said, Kathleen, we manage our elk, we manage our deer, we manage our turkey. Why in the world can't the states manage these horse populations? Because I would argue that obviously they can, and they would be more effective managers. So in the few minutes we have remaining, there are a number of questions. I'm going to try to get to at least a few of those. One of them is Brandon Flack asks, and this is something that I think it really needs to be addressed. He says, I believe that if the law, and by that he means the Wild Horse and Burro Act, is followed and the BLM is allowed to do their job, this problem would be managed properly. Then his question, is there any possibility of that happening, or is there just too much litigation which ties the hands of BLM? And panelists, anyone want to grab that? But again, be very conscious. We've only got a few minutes, so keep your answers fairly short if you would.
The BLM has to deal with congressional riders, and that means that Congress will put a rider on an appropriations bill and tell BLM they cannot spend a dime on euthanizing or selling without limitation these horses. So Congress has got to pull those things.
Yeah, I think that's right. Is there any other thoughts on that?
This is Callie Hendrickson again, and when you bring up the idea of the litigation, and it's not only in this issue but other natural resource issues, but the Equal Access to Justice Act has been used, in my opinion, has been misused to really paralyze our government agencies from being able to do the work that they know and they need to do.
Thank you. All right, anyone else? Okay, someone asked this question, and I think it's worth clarifying because it stands in contradiction to what I think we've heard here today. And the question is, why won't the BLM sell or euthanize these animals? The law allows that to take place. And then they quote the law that would allow them, and Kathleen, you showed slides which seem to be very clear. Help us understand, you know, what seems to be a contradiction to clear guidance that says that they would immediately be removed once they had become excessive in numbers, and that they would be euthanized or in the most humane way possible. Help us understand the contradictions of what appears to be there now.
I think the law is clear, and I think, as was just discussed, we will have Congress respond to the outcries of activists who say that you simply cannot do those things even though they're in the law, and then they put the riders on that say, you know, BLM, you can't spend any money doing this. And the riders are put on and renewed and renewed. And there's a rider this year. BLM can't do it. The law allows it, but the appropriations budget does not allow them to use any money to accomplish that.
Yeah. Well, maybe the last thing, and it's posed as a question, I'm going to answer it first, but then we'd ask the panel to jump in as well. And that is Alma Adams, a friend of mine down in the southern part of the state. He asks, how do we as individuals and government officials get the message of the magnitude of this problem to Congress, so that beneficial action and not a Band-Aid approach can be taken? And I got to go back with what I just said. We need your help. This is one of those things where we feel like we're banging our head against the wall once in a while when we try to educate. And it's not only Democrats, it's many of our Republican colleagues may not understand this as well. They just don't understand Western states issues if you're from Texas or New York or South Carolina. It's alien to them. But I have to tell you that when you come back and you lobby and you educate and you talk to congressional members, that can make a difference. If you spend a few minutes with your colleagues or your friends from other parts of the nation who don't live in Utah or Nevada or some of these other states that are so effective, that can make a difference. And I'm asking you to do that. If we're going to solve this, it's got to be congressional action. Has got to be part of that. And we've got a ways to go to help educating people. Perhaps last comments from any of the panelists on ways that you think you can be effective in helping people understand the magnitude and the urgency of the problem.
Congressman, let me jump in real fast and back up what you're saying. I think that was the whole purpose of presenting this to the Western Governors Association, is we need to make sure that even the Western governors understand the situation. Some of them aren't affected by it. Some of us, some of the states are directly affected, and they can see the importance. And we're thankful to Governor Herbert that he's been there. He's been on the ground. He understands the process and what's going on. But it is an education process, and the one thing that we're trying to do, and with the help of Congressman Stewart and that, we're working on a congressional tour for August next year, and we're going to do it through Nevada and Utah because our time is restricted, but we're going to try and get these congressional members themselves, maybe some of their staff out here, and give them an education on the ground, because until they actually see this, I don't think they believe the pictures. I don't know if they think we're just photoshopping things and we're making things up, but it's critical, the education. And then the other thing about it is any kind of a coalition that we can join or be involved in, any of the organizations, the wildlife, fish and wildlife, the sportsmen's groups, all of these people are coming around and they're understanding the problem, but we just need to get together and take that pressure to Congress to educate Congress.
All right, thank you. Any other final thoughts in 1 minute from any other panelist?
I would just like to note, as Tammy talked about the coalition piece of it, and that's the National Horse and Burro Rangeland Management Coalition, now has 17 national organizations that are members of it, and they represent over 10 million people through those member organizations. We're working really hard to do information and education, but certainly welcome additional ideas and support and so forth. There's a website and Facebook page and so forth. So encourage people to join that, and like you said, talking to legislators and helping them understand is really the key.
All right, well, thank you. We are approaching the end of our time. When I was in the Air Force, I could fly 17 hours to a bomb range in the Middle East and release my bomb plus or minus 1 second. So we're going to end this thing plus or minus 1 second. To those, again, JJ, I know he's gone, but Tammy and Eric and Callie and Kathleen, thank you all. Thanks for your years of service in what is, you know, a very, very important issue here in the West. Bill and Cody and others who helped organize it, thank you all. Mostly to our attendees, thank you for taking time out of your busy day. We appreciate your interest, and we hope it's been beneficial. And this is Congressman Stewart. Thank you all, and good day.
And I'll just mention, we also need to thank you, Congressman Stewart. The fact that you've taken the time to join us and to moderate this discussion, especially when there are, I am certain, plenty of other priorities that you could have been attending to this morning, especially after Tuesday's result. We really, it speaks to the depth of your commitment on this issue, and we really appreciate you taking the time to moderate this discussion.
Happy to be with you. Thank you.
Yep, we appreciate it. Thank you.
And with that, I think we will wrap up this second webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and hope you will stay tuned for future efforts of the National Forest and Rangeland Management Initiative. Thanks again for your time.